Hello everyone, it's time again for a Messer tutorial, and this one will cover Messer Nemen. This is a weird chapter, it doesn't really feel like it has a lot of direction to it. Until you see it, and then it all makes sense. So let's talk about why you would look to this Hauptstück and how you could go about working it into your training. The name is a bit deceptive, as Messer Nemen, or knife taking, seems to suggest that it is all about disarms. There's plenty of that going on here, but it also includes locks, throws, hand shots, and stop thrusts. So what is the common theme here? I think it is all about finishing what you started. Most of the time when we spar, or when we do a competition, we approach a fight as if it is a match to first blood. So you hit your opponent and then take a step back to observe your handiwork and let your opponent then realize that they got hit. Although I think this fits a lot of fencing systems from the late 16th century onward, I do think that German fencing masters from before that time had a slightly different approach. There's very few, if any, mentions of stepping back after an exchange ends, and that makes some sense. It doesn't really matter whether you're trying to restrain your drunk neighbor, dueling a rival in the street, defending against an ambusher on the road, or fighting in armor in war. It doesn't matter whether you're willing and allowed to use lethal force or not. The fight doesn't end when you hit your opponent. There's not really any formalized rules around interpersonal violence in late medieval southern German lands, just an implicit and very fluid understanding of how honor governs such things. So finishing a fight in a position of control was therefore vital, whether that was through a disarm, through hitting multiple times in succession, or maiming someone's weapon hand. In short, German fencing masters taught that the violence will continue until all movement ceases. Messer Nemen is very fitting to all this because it is a catalogue of ways to end a fight, and I mean that in a very literal way. This is the largest Hauptstück by far, and you can very much treat it as a fine selection of finishing moves. For this video though, I would prefer not to talk too much about individual techniques, so I'll pick a few placeholders that I feel form the foundation of most of the others, and instead focus on where and when you should do those techniques. Let's start simple by getting into a high winding. There's many ways to do this, but since I've shown this setup before, let's run with just making a parry in a winding. You are a neighbor and your partner attacks you with a cut from above to either your left or your right side. You parry accordingly, and when this becomes too easy, your partner is then allowed to use body feints to up the challenge. Once you've got the hang of this, you can add the windings. Either wind up after your parry or do an upset and instantly both defend and attack. So far this should be familiar, but if you want to rehash this a little bit more and work on it, then check out the videos in the description. The cool thing about knife taking as a concept is that you can follow up these windings with a further technique. Usually if you've landed your first winding assertively enough, your partner will try to parry a hit that has already landed, which will create an opening on the other side. For this training session, let's try 3 variations. The first involves taking the opponent's weapon arm with your own. The second one pretty much does the same, but now you use your empty hand. For both of these, you pretty much try and bring your hand to your right trouser pocket. For the third one, you can almost go into a half-sword version of the high winding. I think the final position of this one will be also quite familiar to you. Note that all of this works when you defend and wind on your left side. If you wind towards your right side, you have all the same options, but you bring your hands towards your left pocket and you're in the inside of your opponent's weapon's arm. So that's the techniques, but now let's work on some integration. You can, for instance, play a game where your coach scores if they hit you in the mask. They can use body feints, and you need to primarily not get hit. When you do that, there's an additional step for you to score though, because you need to land both a riposte, such as the winding we practiced, and a following grapple to lock down your coach. You'll likely find that the sequence we practiced before works well, but very assertively winding and thrusting on the riposte might mean that you get stuck. Thankfully, you can easily fix this by pulling your thrust back and doing this in quite an exaggerated way. Who could have guessed that theatrics would make for effective fencing? To really work with this concept in your fencing as a whole, you also need to approach your sparring a little bit differently. For now, I will close out by saying that semi-continuous fencing is a great way of practicing this attitude. It will really pay dividends in the more traditional forms of sparring and competition as well, because you really learn to look to control your opponent rather than sneaking a hit and hoping you don't get hit back. That said, I have developed quite a few really nice sparring games recently that deserve their own video to explain properly, so that will be for a later time. Until then, enjoy your training, and I see you all for the next one.